I'd like to now introduce our panelists for tonight. Our panelists, who are seated at the table right here in front of the candidates, are Rick Paulson, Julie Kritz, and H. Dan Ness. Rick is the President and Chief Operating Officer of Douglas Machine. Douglas Machine is a packaging machine manufacturer located here in Alexandria. The company sells cutting-edge packaging machinery to customers throughout the world, and with over 550 employees, it is the largest private employer here in Douglas County. Julie Kritz is the Director of Teaching and Learning for Alexandria Public School District 206. She has worked in the field of education for 28 years as a teacher, principal, and now as a district office administrator. Julie also currently serves as the president of our Alexandria Lakes Area Chamber of Commerce. Dan Ness is the mayor of the city of Alexandria, a position he's held for almost 10 years. He is the past president of the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities, past president of the Minnesota Mayors Association, and is currently the first vice president of the League of Minnesota Cities. He is a retired CPA. Also seated with the panelists up here, closest to me, is our timekeeper for tonight, Alexandria Assistant City Administrator Marty Schultz. Now finally, I have to make a couple of other housekeeping announcements before we begin. In terms of event etiquette, I would ask to remind all of you to please silence all of your electronic equipment, your pagers and beepers and cell phones and so forth. Flash photography will not be allowed this evening during the presentation. Disruptions, including inappropriate comments or actions, the use of inappropriate language and so forth, will not be tolerated, nor will signs, banners, noisemakers, and so forth. Because of our limited amount of time with the speakers tonight, we'd ask that you please hold all of your applause during the question and answers and give that to them at the end of the program so as to afford the candidates the most amount of time possible to answer the questions. Individuals showing blatant disregard for the established etiquette or exhibiting offensive or disruptive behavior will be immediately asked to leave and will be escorted from the room if necessary. There's a reminder at your seats of all of these various rules. Restrooms are located just outside this room to your right. If you have to leave the room for any reason, we ask that you do so quickly and quietly. And now, without any further commentary by me, we will begin our forum. We have decided to go in alphabetical order. So, Senator Dayton, you now have 3 minutes to make your opening remarks. Senator Dayton.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining in with us tonight. I'm very honored to be here at the college that is, according to Washington Monthly, one of the top 8 community colleges, technical colleges in the country, which is a great credit to all of you, and underscores exactly why it is that I'm running for governor, which is to bring your excellence throughout Minnesota, because the caliber of education that's available here, the linkages with area businesses, the opportunities it's providing, those of you who are students here, and I salute those of you who are faculty who have made this award possible, is exactly what we'll need to do to assure the future of this state. You know, the experts tell us that the educational system of this state is the key to our past success, and it's every bit as much, if not more, the key to our future success. When I was Commissioner of Economic Development for Minnesota back in the 1970s, again in the 1980s, I would ask businesses, why are you locating and expanding in our state? And the number one reason was always well-educated, hard-working, productive citizens. And that's been our great strength. It continues to be, and it must be in the future. But I recognize, having been to China 6 times in this decade and seen some of those 1.6 billion people willing to work and work very hard for 60, 70 cents an hour at jobs that were here, that the challenges of the young people in this audience today and their children and grandchildren will face are even greater than the ones that we've experienced over this last half century. Which is why when I look at the cutbacks in funding for education in this state over the last decade, when I see that we now have the 2nd or 3rd highest tuition of any public 2-year colleges in the nation, in the top 10 for our 4-year public universities, when I visit overcrowded classrooms all over the state, see 10 school districts, more to follow, going to 4-day school weeks, not for educational reasons, but for lack of funds, I know that we're heading in the wrong direction, and I know that we're not making the investments necessary to continue this caliber of excellence at our starting with early childhood education, providing, as we should all day, optional kindergarten, K-12 education, and higher education. When I find from the business manager at Wadena that 20 years ago they had $1 million a year for their capital equipment budget so they could provide linkages to businesses like yours. And now, they only, this year, their capital equipment budget is $10,000. I know we're not making the investments necessary to remain competitive as we must be. I look forward to exploring these and other issues with you in the 2 hours that lie ahead. Thank you again for having us today. Thank you for your being with us.
Well, thank you very much. It is a great honor to be here. I want to thank everyone for hosting us, and particularly to thank the audience to get such a terrific turnout on such a lovely fall evening, and thankful that the Twins aren't opening tonight, because I suspect the turnout might be a little bit different, and maybe even Senator Dayton and I would find other reasons.
I know my driver wouldn't be with me today.
Right. You know, I think that as we go forward here in our discussion this evening, you're not going to find disagreement between Senator Dayton and me on the path that we've traveled being the wrong path that has brought us here. I think our disagreements are going to be on where do we need to go in the future. How do we create a different Minnesota? How do we take the great strengths, the great assets that this state has, and build it in ways that are stronger, in ways that are sustainable, in ways that create opportunity for all Minnesotans? And that really is our challenge. I'm always struck by a quote from President Teddy Roosevelt, who said, if we are to be a great nation, we must not merely talk, we must act big. And I think for so long in Minnesota, we've been reliant on talk, on rhetoric, and sometimes on very contentious talk. This is a time for Minnesota to act big. We're at such a critical crossroads in so many issues facing our state. We have a changing economy. We have a changing population. We have a changing place in the world economy. But we're still a strong state. We're a state that needs to act bold, a state that needs to really be willing to take on new ways of thinking about things and move forward, not as Republicans, not as Democrats, but as Minnesotans. And so for me, and I hope for you, this election isn't just about, do we take the status quo, cut it down to the bone, make it a lot smaller and hope it works, or do we take the status quo, raise taxes and make it a lot bigger and hope it works? Because for many Minnesotans who have been playing by the rules, for many Minnesota communities, for many of our great Minnesota institutions, the status quo isn't working. And just making it smaller or larger isn't going to do anything but delay the inevitable day of reckoning. We have to be smarter, we have to be bolder, we have to put aside the talk and be willing to act big. And that's the conversation I'm looking forward to having with you this evening. I thank you very much. I thank Senator Dayton for joining me here, and thanks to all of you for hosting us.
Thank you, gentlemen. The panel will now begin their questioning, and we've attempted to group the questions into related categories and topical areas. And given that we're here at the Alexandria Technical and Community College, it seems appropriate that we would start with education. And the first question will go to Mr. Horner. Mr. Paulson.
The federal government is in the initial stages of reauthorizing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which includes No Child Left Behind. What are your recommendations for revisions to No Child Left Behind?
Well, thank you very much. I think, first of all, we ought to acknowledge that one of the things No Child Left Behind has done is identify the disparities we have in education, the gap that does exist in achievement between white students and students of color. And it's a gap that we have to close. But I also believe that No Child Left Behind has imposed such a rigidity on our schools, on our teachers, on how students are taught, that we're losing the opportunity to really engage kids. Go into our schools and see how many students are left unmotivated, not because of the teachers, but because the teachers are forced to deal with such structure, with such rigidity, that I think we're losing a lot of students. And so I believe that we need to go as governor, as people of Minnesota, to the federal government and either get more flexibility in No Child Left Behind or be willing to say we're going to go it on our own because we can design a better education system in Minnesota. And that does mean that we're going to have honest conversations about what do we do to replace the federal funding that comes with No Child Left Behind. I believe there are a couple of things that are very important to education reform. First, we do need to invest in early childhood learning. We need to make that commitment. When you have 50% of Minnesota children coming into kindergarten not fully prepared for success, it is no wonder that we are seeing high school graduation rates shrinking. But we also need to work with them in their early grades. I was part of a program called Minnesota Reading Corps that engages the private sector with public dollars and engages mentors, volunteers that work with kids to make sure that they're reading at grade level by 3rd grade, the critical benchmark for academic success. Secondly, we need to make sure that we're allowing teachers to teach, that we trust them for their instructional expertise, not just their content expertise. That we say to teachers, we want to make sure you have the autonomy, the authority to make those group of kids, that group of kids in front of you, the most successful they can be. And that's going to take trust, giving them the latitude to do their work as teachers. Thirdly, great schools have great principals. We need to identify what are the skills, the assets that make really good principals, and then go out and recruit those people, give them training, give them rigorous programs in education, in managing schools, and then give them the trust and confidence to lead those schools. And lastly, we do need more flexibility from Education Minnesota. We need the union to be at the table as partners with us to deal with some issues that are hurting our students. We do need some more flexibility in our ability to retain young, innovative teachers, the ones that are creating great programs. Those are the opportunities for us to move forward.
Senator Dayton.
Speaking of the entire act, one of the key features, and I will get to No Child Left Behind in a minute, but would be for the federal government to keep its broken promise of over 30 years to provide 40% of the funding for special education. Today it's less than half of that. And I tried 7 times, offered amendments in my 6 years in the U.S. Senate to meet that commitment fully. And unfortunately, I couldn't get a majority vote in the Senate. I was told it was too expensive. It would have cost us, as a country, $19 billion a year, which was at the time about 2/3 the cost of 1 month in Iraq, which underscores the reality of budgets, federal and state, that they are a reflection of our values and our priorities every bit as much as they are about dollars and cents. But that would have meant an additional $250 million a year of federal funding for all of our school districts to fulfill that unfunded mandate. By contrast, a Race to the Top at most would provide about $175 million in 2 years for Minnesota schools. I voted against No Child Left Behind. Actually, 9 of the 10 members of the Minnesota congressional delegation, so it was bipartisan in opposition. And the reason I did so is because I thought it was going to impose a lot of more testing without the financial wherewithal to pay for that, which has proven also to be the case. And unfortunately, children in Minnesota from grades 3 through 11 are subjected to as many as 61 different state and federally mandated tests. And most of those occur near the end of the winter or the early spring of the school year, and the results aren't made available to the schools till after the school year has ended, which means they obviously cannot be used to improve individual performance. Some states, actually under the Bush administration, applied to the U.S. Department of Education for waive years to take a more innovative approach, and those were granted. Governor Plenty chose not to. But a couple of states took the approach that I would advocate, which is what several school districts in Minnesota, maybe more than I'm not aware of, are employing, which is our individual diagnostic test designed to improve the performance of individual children, which should be our objective. And several of them, for example, 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade, have a 1-minute reading out loud diagnostic test at the beginning of the school year. They can determine whether a child's reading at, above, or below grade level. When funds are available, they can provide individual or small group assistance to those children. And they tell me that in 85% of for the children who stay with the school and with the program for the entire school year, they're reading above grade level by the end of the year. Now that's life transforming. For a child to go from reading below grade level to at or above grade level by the end of an elementary grade is crucial in terms of closing the achievement gap, in terms of giving every child, especially the ones who come from other parts of the country or other parts of the world, don't have the educational experience, a chance to be successful in the future.
Ms. Kritz?
Senator Dayton, in January, one of you will be facing thank you. Start again. In January, one of you will be facing a substantial budget deficit. This deficit has impacted K-12 education through flat funding, aid shifts, and short-term borrowing. What will be your approach to creating new and sustainable streams of revenue for K-12 funding?
That's an excellent question, and the reason to increase revenues, to raise revenues, is I'm proposing by raising the income tax on higher income people, highest income people, is because otherwise we cannot fulfill the commitment that we need to elementary, secondary, post-secondary education. In the last 8 years, state assistance per pupil has been cut by an average of $1,300 per student in real after inflation dollars. That's forced classrooms overcrowded, the 4-day squeaks I described earlier. My first job out of college, I taught in a public school in New York City. I've always said it's the toughest job I ever had. I had 32 children in a 9th grade classroom. And I learned two things right away. One, it takes an incredible amount of skill and dedication to become a good, effective teacher. And secondly, it was certainly not possible for me to reach individually 32 kids in a 9th grade classroom in a 40-minute time period. And the kids in that class spoke 4 different languages. So when I go to Rochester, fairly well-off part of our state, and I see in a 5th grade classroom 36 children, 1 teacher in a school that has 17 different languages, I know that we're, as I say, underfunding the state commitment. And with that cutback of state funding, property taxes have had to go higher. Almost 90% of the school districts in Minnesota are now have school levies for operating deficits. That was never intended, should never be the case, and the Supreme Court ruled 40 years ago, the Minnesota court, that it's unconstitutional to rely on the property tax to fund K-12 education because it's inherently unequal. One school district approves a referendum and those kids, teachers break even, another one disapproves it and those children are punished, penalized effectively. So we need to raise revenues. We need to keep that commitment. We have it's estimated we're going to have 20,000 more children in our K-12 education system in 2 years than we have today. So one of the reasons that the state budget is increasing is Representative Emmer, who's not here tonight, points out, but it is the fact that under the existing school formula, that we need to spend about $1 billion more in state money just to fulfill that formula for all the existing formula for all of our school children. We also have a school shift that was promised to be repaid of $1.4 billion out of the $1.9 billion. My budget would honor that commitment. It's actually a legal requirement as it exists now. I thought when I was in Washington, they came up with these euphemisms for disguising what's really happening. If I were to reach my hand into your pocket and take out your wallet and say, well, I'll give it back to you when I feel like it, in the real world, we don't call that a shift. But that's what they're describing this as. So these are financial obligations that we have as a state to our school districts and most importantly to our school children. And again, with 40% of the state budget going for K-12 education, that's, again, and 20,000 more children coming in and more with learning disadvantages, learning challenges, special needs, we need to fulfill that commitment.
Mr. Horner, before you go on, I should have added, if either of you need the question repeated when it's your turn, feel free to ask, and the panelists will be happy to do that for you.
Thank you very much. Well, this is one of the areas where Senator Dayton and I have fundamental disagreement. Not on the need for sustainable, not on the need for funding for K-12 education, but in 2 other areas. First of all, what caused the shift, and secondly, to make sure that funding is sustainable. So let's take the shift. That was a bipartisan agreement. That was Democrats and Republicans coming together in the legislature to say, we don't want to deal with real issues. We don't want to tackle the challenge of the budget deficit in any meaningful way. The reason we have a $6 billion shortfall this year is because, or in next year, is because in the 2010 budget, Democrats and Republicans said we don't want to deal honestly with the $3 billion shortfall. And so now the next governor is going to have to deal with a $6 billion shortfall. But secondly, we need to make the funding sustainable. And look what's happened over the last 10, 15 years in Minnesota. We have had these huge peaks and valleys, some years big surpluses, some years big deficits. And part of the problem is we have an over-reliance on the income tax. It is a highly volatile tax, and it drives these huge ups and downs. We can't afford to do that anymore. This is one of those areas where we have to be willing not just to talk about a commitment to education, but to be willing to act big in a way that is going to create that sustainable source of funding. So I have talked about tax reform. I do think we need to make a fundamentally different approach to our tax system. I believe we should encourage investments by individuals and businesses in growth, not to pad the bottom line, but to invest in growth. And we ought to make the shift toward more of a consumption tax. We have a tax system created in the 1960s and 70s for an economy steeped in manufacturing and agriculture, for a population of young families coming into their high-earning, high-spending years. Our economy is still dependent in part on manufacturing and natural resources, as we've added more and more service and technology and knowledge businesses, and our population isn't quite as young as it once was. We need to make a change. If we depend on the income tax and even increase that dependence on the income tax, we're going to increase volatility. We need to even that out. We need to say to all Minnesotans, you're all part of the solutions. And so I'm sure we'll talk about this more, but we do need to make fundamental reforms in our tax system because we do need to have a sustainable commitment to K-12 education, not these short gap kinds of solutions that come and go with the political winds.
Mayor Ness.
Under the category of higher education, my question is to Mr. Horner. Since the year 2000, the state of Minnesota has changed its funding priorities, resulting in a significant shift of the cost of higher education to the student. In 2000, state funding accounted for approximately 67% of the cost of higher education at a MNSCU institution. Today, the state of Minnesota funds less than 50% of that cost. As we continue to support reasonable college tuition costs while recognizing shrinking state resources, what would you do as governor to ensure that all students who want to attend college are able to attend college in Minnesota?
Well, thank you, Mayor. The first thing we need to do is to look at the opportunity next year. For maybe what will be the only time in my lifetime, we will have a new president of the university system, a new chancellor of the MNSCU, the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities, and a new governor. If we don't take that opportunity to have a statewide conversation on what do we need out of higher education to be a successful state, what are the needs to make sure that all Minnesotans who want to go to college, who are qualified to go to college, have the opportunity to go to college. And we need to do it in an environment in which everyone is telling us that we're going to need not just more people with degrees, we're going to need a lifetime commitment to education, lifetime learning opportunities. And so I think the answers are going to come in a couple of areas that only an independent governor can put on the table. We do need to say to Minnesotans, let's examine the system. Is it time to look at a realignment between the university and MNSCU, between our 2-year and 4-year schools? Are there opportunities there to be more efficient? Do we have enough bricks and mortar? And are we willing to ask the question of whether we have too many bricks and mortar? Are we willing to take on those challenges? What are the opportunities for integration? And what are the disadvantages? How do we make sure that our great 2-year schools are strong, that they have a core mission that they can deliver on? And I think by asking those questions, we're going to get to the right answers. And so some of the ways in which we can reduce the cost is by making sure that our 2-year schools are fully integrated with high schools, that we do elevate the stature of all of our great community and technical colleges, that kids who maybe aren't quite certain where they want to go, what they want to do, have the opportunity to go into the 2-year schools, to get their generals done at a lower cost, and then make sure that those credits transfer seamlessly not just to MnSCU, but to the university system, to private schools, that they have that opportunity, that we are looking at funding, not just for the institution, but for individuals, that we fund consumers of education, and that we are making the hard choices around where do we get the most value for the dollar. Should we take a look at maybe having centers of excellence, where at some of our 2- and 4-year schools, we can really focus on what they do well and do it in a way that is most cost efficient. Because I think all of those are going to be part of the answer to how we make sure that not only our universities and colleges are affordable, but that they're able to deliver the high-quality education that Minnesota is going to need for us to be a successful state.
Senator Dayton?
Well, the issue again is funding, and since Mr. Horner raised the difference between us and how we would raise revenues is one of the key differences between us, I would agree with him. And mine is to raise the income tax rate on the top, according to the Department of Revenue, 4%. Minnesota's taxpayers, the highest income, 4%. And there is volatility there, but I would say that there's also just as much, if not more, volatility in terms of the sales tax, in terms of what people buy or don't buy during economic cycles. And the reality of the sales tax is it's a more regressive tax. Again, according to the Department of Revenue, three of us agreed that that's our arbiter on these matters. The middle-income Minnesotans pay 2.5 times the percent of their income in the sales tax as do the highest income Minnesotans. Now, our state and local tax system in Minnesota is already regressive in that the top income earners pay a smaller percentage of their income in state and local taxes than the rest of Minnesota. Back under Republican Governor Arnie Carlson, the end of his first term, it was evenly distributed. Since then, it's become more regressive. So mine would make the overall state and local tax burden less regressive, and Mr. Horner's proposal would make it more regressive and put an additional tax burden on middle-income taxpayers. And I think that's wrong. We need the revenues because we need to make that a greater investment on the part of the state in higher education so that we can keep tuition affordable. I hear from working Minnesotans all over the state that can't afford to send their own sons and daughters to our own public colleges and universities. As I said earlier, the tuition that our two-year public colleges is second or third highest of any state in the nation. Back in 2000, we had the 12th highest level among the states in our funding per capita for higher education. And we've dropped now to 35th among the states. We have one of the greatest declines in state support per student for higher education of any state in the nation. We can't afford to continue doing that. We can't afford to keep raising tuitions, and we can't afford to force our young people and their families to go more and more into debt before they even graduated, before they even get their first job. It's wrong in my generation to tell you who are students today that you should get as much education as possible as you should. It's going to benefit you and society, which it will, but we're not going to help you pay for it. And to put you $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 in debt before you graduate from college, as high as $300,000 in debt for someone graduating from medical school these days. I mean, that is just fundamentally misguided on the part of my older generation, and we need to turn that around. We need to remedy that, and if I'm governor, we'll start to do that.
Back to Mr. Paulson.
Another question related to higher education to Senator Dayton. The population growth of the Twin Cities and the demographic shift of people from greater Minnesota to the metro are driving significant shifts of state resources to the metro area. At the same time, higher education in greater Minnesota, particularly two-year technical and community colleges, is more critical than ever. How would you support continued access to higher education in greater Minnesota?
Well, they're both important, and as my former colleague and friend Paul Wellstone said, we all do better when we all do better. So we want the metropolitan area of this state to do well. That's an economic engine. We want greater Minnesota to do well. That's an economic engine. The state funding per student is one in which the colleges and universities are recognized for the number of students that they have. And we would certainly want to continue that, and we can look at that formula if it needs adjustment to be more equitable, to recognize that there are certain maybe additional costs of providing instruction in parts of greater Minnesota where there are broader distances. But the principle that caused the establishment of the college and university system in Minnesota, that everyone should have immediate access from where they live to an excellent 2-year or 4-year college or university, is one that's been one of the great strengths of our state. And you look at the most successful communities around Minnesota, and they're almost inevitably one that has a University of Minnesota or a MnSCU college or university campus. The caliber of people it brings as administrators and professors, the caliber of people it brings as students who are more likely to stay here, it's one of the nuclei of our social and economic success. So I will do whatever's necessary, working with the MnSCU board, to assure the continuing vitality of campuses throughout this state. And the other way in which we can address that issue is with the state bonding bill. I would propose that we have a bonding bill next year of about $1 billion. That Star Tribune editorial board and others have opined that that's not only affordable, it makes good sense given the interest rates as low as they are today and the number of projects that are ready to go. A $1 billion bonding bill is estimated provides the financing for 28,000 jobs in the construction industry and the building trades. Those are people we need to put back to work here in Alexandria and throughout this state. So I would look for opportunities to finance those kinds of improvement projects in campuses throughout the state as well, and if there are areas of particular need because of economic circumstances, to make sure that we're giving special emphasis and weight there.
Well, let me start because I have to correct some of the errors in Senator Dayton's characterization of my tax proposal. First of all, Senator, you're not raising the tax rate just 4%. You're effectively raising taxes that Minnesota individuals and small businesses will pay by 40%, and I think you need to be honest about that. Secondly, every economist who has looked at the tax system has said one of the great problems of Minnesota's tax system is the volatility due to the income tax, and consumption taxes are much more stable. If we want to create long-term plans for education, K-12 as well as higher education, we need a steady, predictable stream of income. We need everybody sharing in the solutions. And Senator, you also need to acknowledge that the economists who have looked at our 3 plans, including Art Rolnick, who for 25 years was one of the leading economists in the Federal Reserve System, and others consistently have said, mine is the best of the 3 plans, because mine's the plan that addresses the future. And if that's not enough, Senator, look at your own party. The chair of the Senate Tax Committee this year, Senator Bach, he favored a sales tax approach. Senator Rest, another Democratic leader on taxes, she favors a tax approach. So even within your own party, they're acknowledging that an income tax-based system in today's economy, if we don't exist 12 years ago, the economy has changed dramatically in 12 years. We can't have a tax system that met the needs of more than a decade ago. We need a tax system that's going to address the needs of a decade from now. That's the difference. We need to look to the future. And that gets us to higher education. Absolutely. I have a budget that raises the revenue, that puts new money into higher education, particularly into our 2-year schools. Because I do think when you look at the importance of how our 2-year schools have been integrated into our regional economic assets, look what Alexandria Technical and Community College has done through basic research and applied research, working with Mr. Paulson's company to create innovative answers to packaging needs. Look at what Central Lakes Community College is doing in Staples with its heavy equipment, maintenance, and operations. I mean, 100 slots. They fill those 100 slots. They could fill many more. Those students, some of them veterans in transition, workers in transition, traditional students, will graduate into jobs. 95% of them will find jobs paying $15 to $30 an hour. If we want a future in Minnesota, we absolutely need to be investing in our 2-year schools, and then we need to say we're going to continue investing in them for the future with a source of revenue, with policy commitments that are stable, that are permanent, that look to the future, not to the past.
Mr. Horner, I'm going to give you a minute here. I think the question that Mayor Ness proposed said, as we continue to support reasonable college tuition costs while recognizing shrinking state resources, what would you do as governor to ensure that all students who want to attend college are able to attend college in Minnesota? Wondering if you can give us some specific examples of how you might facilitate that, and I'll give you another.
Sure. Now,
minute.
that was the question before, and I'm happy to address that again. I did address that by saying that we do need to have the conversation around what is it that we're going to do to make sure that we have the conversation around how do we keep strong 2- and 4-year schools. I do believe that we need to make an investment in talking about do we have the right alignment of systems? Are we spending too much money on bricks and mortar, not enough money on curriculum and on access? Do we need to change some of the funding to fund students rather than the institutions? Do we need to make some of those very difficult and sustainable changes that I think I did address?
Okay, and I apologize.
Nope, that's fine.
Thank you. I think we're on to Ms. Kritz.
Yes. This next section is on local government, and this first question is to Mr. Horner. Will you work to preserve LGA for cities, and if so, to what level of funding?
Absolutely, and again, my budget has in it money to continue LGA at the projected level so that we will continue to fund it. Now, I think a couple of things are important. One is that we do need to take a look at local government assistance to make sure that the formula gets the money to the right communities in the right amount. Not to reduce the money, but to make sure that in the right amount it's going to the right communities. Secondly, I think there are some smart things we can do. Right now, local governments pay taxes, sales taxes to the state government. That money goes up to the state government, takes a little bit of an administrative haircut, and then effectively comes back to communities as part of LGA. We ought to just exempt local governments from the sales tax up front instead of putting it through that bureaucratic process and then calculate that into LGA. So we do need to do that. When you have a situation where Crookston, for example, can raise taxes by 1% and raise $4 per person, Wayzata raises taxes 1% and collects $40 per person, there's the disparity. That's what we need to address. We need to make sure that every community in Minnesota, every person in Minnesota, has access to excellence in core services. And yet, the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities earlier this year did a survey of members and found that some 40% of cities around the state, of their member cities, had to cut basic services, fire and police. And that was before the 2010 legislative cuts passed by Democrats and Republicans. So we do need to make sure that we have that commitment. But I'll also say that if we're going to have strong communities, we need to look beyond LGA. We do need to have strong 2-year schools that are fully integrated into the regional economic base. We need to have smarter health care policy. Look at how the infrastructure of our rural health care systems is being eroded by bad public policy decisions coming out of the legislature, coming out of the governor. Look at what has happened with our local hospitals, many, and our local nursing homes, many of which are tied to local hospitals. 28% of nursing homes, many of them in rural Minnesota, are in financial peril, are in jeopardy of closing. We will not have strong communities if we don't have a strong healthcare infrastructure. Alexandria is fortunate. You have a great hospital, ribbon cutting coming up, that's terrific. Other communities aren't quite as fortunate. We need to make sure that we have strong healthcare throughout the state. A strong infrastructure. We need to invest in roads, in bridges. We need to invest in rail transportation. It's all of these things that make for a strong community. LGA is a critical component of it. But if we don't do all of these other things, all the LGA in the world isn't going to preserve the strength and integrity of our great Minnesota communities.
Thank you. Senator Dayton.
My budget will fund local government aids at the level projected for the 2012-13 biennium. We'll continue that commitment, and I will not, as has happened in the last couple of years, to cities, counties, and school districts, solve the state's fiscal difficulties on the backs of local governments. And I've held 112 committee meetings around the state thus far, and I've heard from so many mayors and council members, county commissioners, that they feel that the trust has been broken between local governments and the state government, because they can't rely on the commitments that have been made at the beginning of the biennium or the beginning of the fiscal year, and then in the middle of their fiscal year, these funds are withheld, shifted, or borrowed. Although borrowing, again, presumes a willing borrower as well as a willing lender, and so again, that's a bit of a misnomer the way it's been handled. I reported by KSAX, Mayor Ness has said that because of the cuts in local government aids here in Alexandria, 2 police officers scheduled for hire were cut, along with overtime snowplowing hours and $25,000 for street repair. That kind of drastic effect has occurred here and has occurred in the cities throughout Minnesota. And also, the Minnesota Department of Revenue says for every dollar funding cut for local government aids or county aid or school district aid, property taxes go up by 67 cents. So for every dollar the local government aid that's cut, property taxes go up 67 cents, which is why, despite the mantra of the last 8 years of no new taxes, people in Minnesota have experienced property tax increases from $4 billion 8 years ago to $7 billion today. And one independent group, Minnesota 2020, has analyzed the effects of Representative Emmer's proposed cuts of about 1/3 in LGA and found that the property tax would increase to the city levy here in Alexandria by 8.4% in the year following if that cut were enacted. So these are real effects in terms of services. These are real effects in terms of higher property taxes. And again, I would believe the state has a responsibility to make its commitments and keep the level of funding such that we can keep property tax increases down. Hopefully eliminate those increases.
Thank you. Mayor Ness.
So I quoted you correctly, sir.
Yes, and I would love to keep on this topic, but we must keep moving along, unfortunately. Senator Dayton, what can you do to reduce unfunded mandates and support fair and equitable funding of bonding projects throughout the state?
Well, with regard to the mandates, Mayor, I'll be glad to work with you and other mayors, to work with the counties, county commissioners to identify those areas. I agree with you that those mandates should be A, reduced, and B, they should be funded. And you know, I think the fact that I was at the League of Greater Minnesota Cities gathering in Winona a short while ago with Mr. Horner here, I was at the Association of Minnesota Counties gathering a short while ago. We're here tonight, and evidence is that willingness to work with local officials, particularly in Greater Minnesota. Because as I have gone far, again, through my 112 community meetings, at least one in every county, as I get farther away from St. Paul, I find, as I say, more difficulties that local officials have, that citizens have, with the lack of recognition of the differences from one part of a state to another. I remember one farmer in Warren, Minnesota, up in northwestern Minnesota, said, if we could just combine the expertise in St. Paul with the walk the land wisdom of people like me in Warren, we'd get a lot more done. And I think that's the right approach. So reducing the mandates themselves, creating greater flexibility. You know, you and others are elected by the people, by your fellow citizens, by your neighbors. I say local government officials have the most challenging jobs because the people know where you live, they know your home phone number, you see them walking down the street every day. And I want to work in partnership, as I did when I was state auditor, where I developed a very healthy respect and admiration for the work that local government officials do, and a recognition that you take those responsibilities enormously seriously, that you're looking for ways, as we must continue to do, to find greater efficiencies, to find ways we can reduce spending. That's been an imperative. In fact, local governments have handled their affairs, financial affairs, far more responsibly in the last years than the state government has. With regard to bonding, you know, as I said earlier, I would like to see $1 billion bonding bill in the beginning of next year. As I said, that would provide the financing for up to 28,000 construction jobs all over the state of Minnesota, important projects, civic improvement projects, MnSCU campus improvement projects, others. And I will not play politics with those, I give you my word. First of all, we're going to start with the ones that Governor Plenty vetoed last spring, where he left an estimated 400,000 work hours on the table and thousands of people in Minnesota who need work on the bench. And so those projects, regardless of their political, persuasion of their legislators, are ones that will get first priority. And my second priority will be other projects like that that have significance that are ready to go so we can get them going, putting people to work, and I pledge that I will not permit the legislature to play politics with regard to those projects.
Well, the mandates are an area, of course, where Republicans and Democrats both conspire to impose more regulations, more restrictions, more obligations on local governments because it's an easy way out. In many counties, 40% of your property tax, of your county property tax, is due directly to pay for unfunded mandates. So to simply say that we should get rid of them is one thing. To have the courage to say we're really going to have a systematic process of evaluating them and get rid of those that aren't providing value is quite another. And that's what I've proposed in my budget, is that we come in and we have a 3-year sunset on unfunded mandates and force the legislature to take a look at each and every one of them. Some of them we may decide are worthwhile. Some of them we should throw out. My lieutenant governor running mate, Jim Mulder, spent 20 years as the executive director of the Association of Minnesota Counties. Jim probably knows as much about the relationship between state government and local governments as anybody in the state. And one of the things that I was so pleased with is that here's a guy with all of this expertise who's willing to take on this portfolio to really reform how we relate to local governments, to really change what we expect of local governments and the relationship between the state and local governments. So absolutely, we need to get rid of the mandates. I mean, we're spending literally tens of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in funding mandates where the legislature wants the political recognition, doesn't have the political courage to put up the funding for it. We can't afford that anymore. We need different kind of leadership. On the bonding bill, I think frankly in today's economy, with the budget deficit that we already have, to ask Minnesota taxpayers to support a $1 billion bonding bill goes too far with all of the other priorities that we have. We simply can't keep saying, we'll promise this, we'll promise that, we'll promise that, and then we'll just raise the taxes on a few Minnesotans and let everybody else off the hook. It doesn't work that way. And I think in our hearts, we all know it doesn't work that way. We know who's going to pay for it, all of us. So let's be honest about it. I think we ought to do a $400 million bonding bill. We can afford that. We can afford it in a balanced budget. We ought to put the priority on bridges and roads and some academic projects that are ready to go, not just to create the short-term jobs, but also to make that investment in long-term economic development.
Thank you, Mr. Horner. As much as Mayor Ness would like to continue on this topic of local government, we're going to move on to health care. So our next question will come from Mr. Paulson.
Okay, we will begin with Mr. Horner. What are your plans for general medical assistance care if you are elected to office?
Well, and I think general assistance medical care is really one of those public policies that belongs in the Hall of Shame for everybody in the legislature and for Governor Pawlenty. I mean, here's a program that serves the most vulnerable and poorest Minnesotans. These are people with income of $8,000 or less, with assets that average less than $1,000, and that often have severe problems, health problems, often mental health problems. And what we've asked them to do in the name of efficiency, in the name of saving the political rear ends of some politicians, is we're going to dump you on local hospitals. And that's a policy that is doomed to failure from the beginning. It doesn't work for the people who need the health care. It's certainly not working for rural hospitals, and it doesn't work for any of us. We don't save health care costs when we just shift it to other people. We just ask other people to pay for it. And so look what we've done. We've asked providers across Minnesota, rural hospitals, nursing homes, physicians, if you're poor and live in rural Minnesota, try to get dental care. Not because dentists are cheap and greedy, but because we pay them about 30 cents on the dollar. They can't afford to do it. And anybody in healthcare knows that if you defer oral health problems, eventually you're going to have significant physical health problems. It will cost us more in the long run. We need structural reform. We need to do things better. We need to be much smarter about how we deliver health care. And I believe it does start, and again, I have specific budget, money in my budget proposal. We ought to take the early opt-in to Medicaid, part of the federal health program. Not because we get all this federal money, but because we can cover more Minnesotans. And the way we're going to get to true health reform is when we have more Minnesotans covered. But then we ought to be smart about it. Look, the Department of Health dealt with kids with asthma, especially poor kids, one of the great drivers of emergency room use. And they looked upstream, and they were willing to go into the apartments of lower income people, change out pillowcases to hyperallergenic pillowcases, help people understand the need to clean, to vacuum. They saved $2,000 per child per year. More importantly, they reduced absences from school by 7 days per year. Talk about the achievement gap. There it is. But it costs money up front. And so the state took away the program. And we don't do that anymore. Instead, we pay the emergency room costs. And the kids are missing school, and we will have a bigger achievement gap. That's where we need to be looking for leadership, is in these creative policies that take the courage to say we need to spend money now to save a lot of money long term.
Senator Dayton?
We could eliminate the GAMC program if we chose the early opt-in for Medicaid, and Mr. Horner and I agree on that. Representative Emmer disagrees. I wish he were here to explain why he thinks it's advisable that Minnesota's sacrificed almost $100 million already. We lose almost $1 million a day by not opting in early. That would provide funding, the total funding for the early opt-in for Douglas County Hospital here would be about $1.6 million. So it's very serious money that, as Mr. Horner said, it allows us to take care of the poorest of the poor, and also importantly, provides the financial stability and the financial resources to Douglas County Hospital and to hospitals all over Minnesota, particularly greater Minnesota, that have a higher percentage of elderly and indigent patients who otherwise whose financial stability is otherwise jeopardized, and that jeopardizes their ability to provide quality health care to all of us, to all the citizens of Minnesota. So this is a win-win scenario for everybody. The state invests a net about $140 million, which has already been provided for by the legislature and the governor in the next biennial budget, and receives about $1.4 billion back now after the governor's failure to opt in. It's down to about $1.3 billion, which is still about a 7-to-1 return on our state expenditure. And as I say, the financial stability it provides to area hospitals throughout the state is invaluable. So, and as I say, would provide the funds necessary to take over the GAMC, which is another advantage of doing so.
Ms. Kritz?
All right. Senator Dayton, as you know, we have a growing older adult population in western Minnesota and throughout this state. Can you give us your thoughts on how your administrations would approach older adult services and nursing home funding in the next years?
Well, it's one of the most important challenges that we face because, as you said, we have an aging population everywhere, but even more so in greater Minnesota. And we also are seeing, and the report just came out about 2 weeks ago, that said that in the last year, some 50,000 Minnesotans of all ages have gone from private insurance to the public sector programs because they either lost their insurance through their employer, they've lost their jobs, or they can't afford the cost of the health insurance through private employers. So we have more people that are going to these public health programs, and the costs are going to continue to drive. You know, it's going to be an ongoing challenge, and the state legislature deserves credit in a bipartisan way for addressing some of these. For example, with elderly waivers, which gives the elderly the options to stay in their homes, which most want to do, and provides an alternative to long-term nursing home care that's less costly, and that means that we have in the last 6 or 7 years reduced the percent of our expenditures going to nursing homes for long-term care from about 88% of the total down to about 72% of the total. And so those kinds of outreach services and, Meals on Wheels and other supportive services and monitoring so that the elderly can be at home and know that if something befalls them, that they're going to get immediate assistance, that their family members have that same reassurance. So those are the kinds of innovations that we're going to need. And we're going to need to also face up to the financing, which is what it's going to be an ongoing challenge, and it's going to mean we're going to have to look at the entire whole area in which way in which we pay for health care, because these costs are simply going to be unsustainable at the state level, the federal level, and the private sector. And I think we have to look at it holistically, because it's all part of the same. It's the societal costs of providing health care, quality health care, which means that we need to make sure that every health care dollar, as much of that as possible, is going actually into provision of health care. And I'm concerned when I see institutions like United Healthcare, the largest health insurance company in the country, reporting a quarterly profit of over $1 billion. And by its own reckoning, for every health care premium dollar it takes in, it pays only 81 cents for health care. Medicare, which may be far from perfect, pays 97 cents of every health care dollar for health care. So that's 16 cents on every dollar differential is one of the reasons I hear from Minnesotans all over the state that health insurance is increasingly unaffordable. And even for those who have insurance, with the deductibles and the copays, the cost of health care. So we're embarked now over the years ahead in this attempt to provide comprehensive insurance for all Americans so that we don't have such a high percentage of uninsured, which also drive up costs for emergency rooms and for ultimately indirectly all of us. We need to make that work and make it more cost effective so that we can afford health care.
Well, I believe the question is, how are we going to deal with older adult services? So let me give you 3 very specific answers. The first is that we do have to deal with Minnesota's nursing homes. As I said, 28% of nursing homes are in financial peril, many of them in rural Minnesota, many of them connected to rural hospitals. It is the potential to collapse much of our rural health infrastructure if we don't deal with it. So 2 things we can do immediately, 2 things we can do next year under new governor's leadership. The first is that we do have to deal with the reimbursement issue. We have to make sure that nursing homes are reimbursed at a rate that meets their cost, and sadly enough, that isn't even happening in many cases, and gives them the opportunity to have some, to retain some capital so that they can meet emergencies, so that they can provide adequate pay to their staff. So we have to deal with the reimbursement issue. But secondly, we have to give nursing homes more flexibility in their licensing. Right now, there are a lot of nursing homes that are licensed for high-level skilled nursing facilities, very expensive care. There are a lot of people who don't need that high level of care. If we could get the state to give them a little more flexibility in their licensing, so maybe some beds could be opened up to people who need less intense care. Provide those people with a place where they can live safely, comfortably, get the services they need, bring in some more revenue to nursing homes by creating more flexibility in the licensing process. We've got to use just some common sense sometimes. But beyond that, it's not just about the nursing homes. We need to make sure that Minnesotans have the opportunity to age in place. So the second thing we ought to do is take a lesson from a terrific program in Steele County that also operates in some other counties, Healthy Seniors. They use a little bit of federal money, a little bit of state money. They've created a consortium of nonprofit agencies to help people age in place, to keep them out of nursing homes. Last year, they averted hundreds of months of nursing home care. When you think that nursing home care costs $5,000 a month, 2/3 of which is paid by the public, that's a huge savings and an improvement in the quality of life for seniors. And thirdly, we need to accept more individual responsibility. We cannot allow the spend down of assets to, in effect, be the deductible to pay for Medicaid. It's not fair to us. It's particularly not fair to young people. We need to make sure that we create opportunities for all of us to save and to buy insurance for our own older adult care.
Thank you. We're going to move on now to manufacturing. Our first question will come from Mayor Ness.
Address this to Mr. Horner. To remain competitive in today's global economy, technology and manufacturing companies are faced with ongoing education needs to constantly retrain their workforce on manufacturing best practices and adopting new technologies. What role do you envision for the state of Minnesota in helping technology and manufacturing companies retrain their workforce now and in the future?
Well, and I think this is a critical question, and I think in part we've answered it in our discussion of higher education, because I think the answer to this is we need to start thinking of education as a seamless, lifelong process. Break down the silos. It's not just pre-K, K-12, 2-year, 4-year worker training. It is lifelong learning, and we need to make that investment. And a lot of that lifelong learning is going to come through our 2-year schools, particularly our technical colleges. So we need to be willing to invest in those technical colleges. But we also need to make sure that they are delivering on their core mission, that they are fully integrated into the local regional economic assets, that they are working with the local employers, the local industrial base, the manufacturing base, to make sure that they do have the skill set, the skill development curricula that will make sure that people, both those traditional students as well as veterans coming back, as well as older workers in transition, have the ability to develop new skills, have the ability to refresh skills. And that just becomes a critical component of who we are as a state and how we look to the future, that we have that commitment to lifelong learning.
Senator Dayton.
Well, it underscores again, Mayor, what I said before about the importance of making the investments in the technical colleges such as here in Alexandria, so that they have the sophisticated capability to meet the needs of sophisticated businesses. And I go again to the illustration with Dina. If we're not providing the funds necessary for them to continue to have state-of-the-art facilities and the equipment and machinery that workers are going to be using where they're working, and this needs to be in close cooperation, as the best technical colleges do, with the area businesses, to find out what are their changing needs and what are the changing skills, and even what are the machines or equipment that they're going to be utilizing. Then if that breakdown occurs, or if we don't make the investment as a state in providing that capability, then we really don't give businesses what they need, which is that both training of new workers as well as the retraining. The displaced worker program, which 95% of which is administered, conducted through the MnSCU campuses, is another important way that we provide retraining for workers who have lost their jobs. And as Mr. Horner is absolutely right, this is a lifelong process, so we're going to need to enable people to make these adjustments throughout their lifetimes and adapt the skills that they have, the experience, into other situations. The actual, as former President Bill Clinton, when he was here a couple weeks ago, pointed out that the number of job openings is growing rapidly here in Minnesota and elsewhere around the country, but there's a mismatch with the skills of workers who have been laid off, are out of work. We have over 200,000 now in Minnesota, and the skills that those job openings are looking for. So creating a better training, a better retraining, having our MnSCU system do a better job of forecasting what kind of jobs our economy is going to be generating and is going to be looking for workers, new and retrained, is going to be a key part of matching up and having a better fit between what we're providing in terms of vocational training and education and the jobs that are going to be available for young people when they, or middle-aged or older people, when they complete that training or retraining.
Thank you. Mr. Paulson.
Yes, Senator Dayton. The bioscience marketplace presents a large opportunity for growth for established and startup businesses. It appears that Minnesota is slipping behind several other states in promoting and helping companies enter into this fast-growing market. In your opinion, what should the state of Minnesota do to promote the bioscience industry statewide?
Well, you're correct, and you pointed out that that's one of the great strengths of our technology economy in the past. And I remember going to China a couple of years ago and meeting with the deputy mayor of Shanghai, and he asked where I was from. I said, Minnesota. I said, have you heard of Minnesota? And he smiled and he tapped his chest. He said, Medtronic. So, these products that we create, Minnesota companies create, not only provided important employment for many thousands of Minnesotans, but they're the best kind of goodwill that we can exchange with people throughout the world when they can also benefit, as our citizens do, from these biotechnological advances. I was at Rochester last week, met with the Mayo Clinic top administrators, and they described a biotechnical partnership that they have established the last few years with the University of Minnesota Medical School. So that linkage, they hope, and with the additional funds that I've pledged, I think others have too, would continue to advance that partnership. And we ought to link other campuses around the state in with that, so that other regions of Minnesota can derive that benefit as well. And recognize again that kind of spin-off, we need to improve the quality at the University of Minnesota Medical School. And I graduated from college, I was pre-med in college, and I applied to medical schools. Minnesota was ranked in the top 8 in the country. Now it's ranked in the top 12 for primary care, but only 30th for research. And I asked those at the Mayo, and they were being respectful, and they thought there were some areas of real strength and other areas that could, I read between the lines, could use some improvement. And that's a invaluable resource we have for the entire state, that we absolutely need to have be one of the premier medical institutions in the country for the training it provides our future doctors, but also for those spin-off benefits as you described. The other side of it is the financing, and last year the legislature passed the angel investor tax credit. That is following the initiative that Wisconsin had used quite successfully to encourage investments in these kinds of startup technology, high technology businesses. Representative Emmer voted against it. I think that was a good measure that should be supported, and if I'm governor, we'll follow it. If it needs to be continued or expanded, if it's demonstrating the results hoped for in terms of providing investment capital for these kinds of businesses, and that's the kind of investments that we ought to be encouraging.
Well, and we ought to think more broadly than just health and medical, as important as that is in Minnesota, and I'll address those specifically. But we also need to think about the opportunities in broader life sciences, biosciences. Look at the Ag Center in Staples, part of another great community college that really is doing groundbreaking work in developing new opportunities with our agricultural products in so many ways. So we need to also make sure that we're investing in broader areas than just health and medical products. Here, look at a couple of things that we absolutely need to do. First of all, we need to make sure that we're funding research, basic and applied research at our 2- and 4-year schools, and particularly at the University of Minnesota. I'm the only one that specifically in my budget, with the funds to pay for it, have said we ought to add $30 million in state funding to research. And we ought to do it as a separate line item in the state budget, both because we need it at our schools, but also because that's the way we elevate the conversation in Minnesota around the importance of research, around the importance of innovation, around what it means for Minnesota to truly be a knowledge state. Secondly, we need to make sure that we are investing in the infrastructure of biosciences. 2 years ago, a bonding bill passed that created or accelerated the creation of a biomedical diversity campus on the University of Minnesota. They're now putting up their 5th building. Right next door to it is a private sector campus of venture capitalists and private companies that are going to commercialize those products, those ideas coming out of the university, creating Minnesota jobs and creating Minnesota businesses. But here's the challenge, and it is an area where Senator Dayton's tax proposal will set us back terribly. Look what's happening right now, is that these great ideas coming out of the University of Minnesota, the great talent that is in Minnesota is now migrating to Hudson, Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin, because they've created a tax environment more favorable to investment, because they're not taxing small businesses the way Senator Dayton would, because they're not taxing the kind of talent that we need to develop these industries the way Senator Dayton would. I agree. I think the next Medtronic will come out of the University of Minnesota research. It will be created by the talent that was trained here. Unfortunately, it's likely that it's going to have a Wisconsin address if we're not smart about it. So we do need to make those investments. We need to invest in research, in the talent, but also in a tax system that works in Minnesota, allows investment, attracts the talent, and retains the talent in Minnesota to make it work for all Minnesotans.
Thank you, Mr. Horner. Our next question, we're going to move on to a new topic. We're now going to be talking a little bit about economic development. So our first question to Mr. Horner from Ms. Kritz.
All three major party candidates have been critical of the Job Opportunity Building Zone program and its impacts. What is your plan for enticing and supporting business growth in Minnesota? What are key elements of your economic development program?
Well, and I'm not as critical of Job Z as the legislative auditor has been when he did his evaluation of Job Z and found out that largely the tax incentives are going to move jobs from one part of the state to another part of the state, not creating new jobs, not creating new wealth, new prosperity. I don't think we can afford to spend our tax dollars that way. I think we need to invest tax dollars in ways that create new prosperity, new jobs for Minnesotans. And so while I think we do have to honor the obligations that we have out there, we should phase out Job Z and those kinds of subsidy programs. And instead, I think we need to invest in the tools for economic development that are going to work for all communities. And a couple of those include, as we've talked about, making sure that we are investing in education, that we have strong two-year schools that are fully integrated into the regional economic assets. Secondly, I think we need to make sure that we're investing in the infrastructure of economic development, that we are providing the resources, the grants, the tools to make sure that communities have all of the tools, the infrastructure that is necessary to attract businesses, the industrial parks, the appropriate updated water treatment facilities, a healthcare infrastructure. Those are the kinds of things that businesses look for. Thirdly, I think we do need to make sure that Minnesota is a leader in access to high-speed broadband. It is going to be the gateway to world-class education, health care, economic development opportunities. I hope that in most parts of the state where there is population density, that will be a private investment. There are going to be parts of the state where it's going to take a public-private partnership. And there are parts of the state where access will only come through a public investment. And we ought to make that investment. We ought to treat that as our parents and grandparents treated the Rural Electrification Act. It is that important to our future. But then we also need tax reform. You know, one of my proposals is to eliminate upfront the sales tax on capital equipment purchases. Allow manufacturers to get that tax exemption from the first day. Right now, they have to file a sheaf of papers about that thick, and it can take 2 years to get a refund on the tax. Small manufacturers can't afford that. So we need to be smart. Again, it's common sense. If we're going to give them the money back, let's just not charge them the tax in the first place. Give them the resources to invest in that equipment. Create new incentives for small businesses to invest in research, development, technology. That's what's going to help small businesses around the state, including our rural Minnesota communities, to grow and to prosper.
Senator Dayton.
Well, the legislative auditor was critical of the Job Z for the reasons that Mr. Horner outlined. And, you know, by contrast, when I became a Commissioner of Energy and Economic Development in 1983 for the last really great jobs governor, Rudy Perpich, he and the legislature devised some incentives, including enterprise zone tax credits that were focused on manufacturing, on new or expanded. And I, in the fall of 1983, went up to Thief River Falls, provided the first of those tax credits for a 7-person shop called Artco, which is now Articat, which employs about 1,600 people. So that's where you look to target incentives on manufacturing and on jobs that will be created that wouldn't have been otherwise. And I would agree with Mr. Horner on some of the key ingredients of a proposal. One would be the infrastructure. That is absolutely one of the essential ingredients for economic growth, and we've lagged seriously behind in that respect. We've spent, if you factor in inflation, about $15 billion less for our highways and public transit over the last 20 years than we would have if we kept pace with where it was in 1990. And if you want a real-life, real-world example of what happens when you don't make the necessary public investments over a period of 20 years. Look at the deterioration of our highways throughout greater Minnesota, the increasing congestion in metropolitan areas, and that to me is one of the most serious business impediments to business and economic growth that we face in this state. I agree also with the broadband having been in 87 counties in 87 days in every parts of Minnesota. I want seamless border-to-border internet and cell phone coverage across the state, and I'll do everything I possibly can as governor to achieve that. I also want to go back to the Star Cities for Economic Development program that I inherited when I was Commissioner of Economic Development from my successor under Governor Quee, but expanded that to what was then was really considered one of the best state-of-the-art local economic development training programs in the country, and established a partnership between the governor, the department, and the local governments, chambers, economic development organizations, and looking for business opportunities all over the state of Minnesota. And also tourism, which is so vitally important to the economy here. We know that tourism is an $11 billion industry in Minnesota. We also have been analysis shows that for every $1 the state invests in tourism advertising and promotion, it generates $4.60 in state and local tax revenues, about $54 in local economic development activity. So it's money extremely well invested, and yet the state budget for the Explore Minnesota is only about 2/3 in real dollars of what it was in 1990, and the advertising and promotion budget is only about half of what it was at that time. So making that recommitment is going to be crucial to revitalizing the state's effort to work in partnership with businesses and chambers and local development organizations in the vital tourism part of our state.
Thank you, Senator. Mayor Ness?
The question is addressed to Senator Dayton. The last several legislative sessions have limited funding and support for the Minnesota Investment Fund and Small Cities Grant Program. These programs have had strong success in rural Minnesota. How do you propose reinstating and increasing the funding for these programs?
Well, Mayor, I actually started the Economic Recovery Fund when I was commissioner. I don't have that many original ideas, but that was one of them. And I'm delighted that it's still being continued, even though the funding has been cut back. And I found then that the awards that we made, grants of up to $500,000, I think that's still basically the same, that could be then used for loans to businesses. And again, we focused it back then on manufacturing. And then when those loans were repaid, the funds were retained by local governments, and they were used to set revolving loan funds that could be used, and that money could be loaned out to other businesses. So I think that's, again, an example of the sound partnership the state should establish with local governments, with chambers, with local development organizations. And I think the benefits of those, I haven't seen the analysis. Maybe if they're more interested in cutting it back than expanding, the deed hasn't done it. But back then, we could demonstrate that those dollars brought a multiple in terms of wages and in terms of state and local tax revenues for the dollars that were committed. So it was a sound investment. And as I say, again, one example of the kind of partnership between state and local governments and the public-private partnership that's been important to economic growth, especially in greater Minnesota.
You're such a patient audience, and I appreciate it. You know, we're covering a lot of familiar ground here, and so I do want to be respectful of your time and your patience. You know, I agree with that we need to have these kinds of investment programs. I agree that we need to make investments in rural Minnesota. I think that by cooperating with the initiative funds around the state, by cooperating with other foundations, by looking at what our chambers of commerce and economic development commissions offer, that we really can create a dynamic that is going to build a strong, healthy rural Minnesota. And we need to do that. And so, yes, these programs are important, but they build only on the success that we're going to have if we're making smart investments in education, in healthcare, and the infrastructure. Any of these programs on their own simply isn't going to do it. We need to have a sustainable commitment to an integrated approach that says rural Minnesota will thrive if we're making investments in all of these areas, sustainable investments, investments that really are about the future.
Thank you. One more economic development question at this point. This one will come from Mr. Paulson.
Yes, Mr. Horner. A study conducted by West Central Initiative Foundation identified over $800 million needed to upgrade and replace failing infrastructure in the communities represented by the West Central Initiative Foundation. How do you propose to address this issue of infrastructure funding for rural Minnesota cities and regions?
Well, and again, this is an area where I think we're going to have to be honest with the people. We do have a failing infrastructure. There's a report out today that talks about the impact of our failing infrastructure on economic development, on prosperity, on personal wealth. It is directly related. And so a couple of things. One is that we do need to do thoughtful, responsible bonding. I've proposed a $400 million bill next year. I think that's affordable. And then we can see where the economy is at in 2012 and what we can do in the traditional bonding year. And part of that needs to be to make smart decisions. We ought to be doing more investment in 10-ton roads. We ought to be investing in rail to move both product and passengers around the state. So it's all of those kinds of things. But then we have to look at, we can't just rely on bonding. We can't rely on the gas tax. With alternative fuels, and many of us in rural Minnesota want more alternative fuels, with green energy, with more energy efficient cars and trucks, we are going to have to look at funding sources that go beyond the gas tax. And so we have to figure out how is it that we're going to fund these infrastructure needs. The Minnesota Department of Transportation estimates that in the next 20 years, the state will need for highways and bridges to maintain capacity $65 billion. They've identified $15 billion in funding. We have a $50 billion gap, and we better be honest about it. Traditionally, what would happen is legislators would say, well, great, $15 billion, we'll divide that by 201, the number of legislative districts, and everybody gets a little piece of it. We can't afford to do that anymore. We need to say, as a state, what are our top priorities in infrastructure against economic development, against economic assets? What's really going to create prosperity for Minnesota? And those are the infrastructure assets that we ought to apply the $15 billion to. And then we're going to have another tier of projects where we say these are also important. We need to create new funding sources. How are we going to pay for them? And we ought to pay for them honestly. But then there's going to be a third tier of projects where we have to have the courage as political leaders to say, sorry, can't afford them anymore. We can't pay for them. They're not priorities. They're not going to generate economic growth. That's what the leadership we need for the next 4 years is going to take, to have that kind of courage to make those kinds of decisions.
Senator Dayton.
Well, Mr. Horner, in your budget, you're proposing elimination of the water grants, of the solid waste grants, and the ethanol credit, as well as the elimination of county program aid, almost $400 million, replacing that with a county sales tax option, which has been opposed by the Association of Minnesota Counties Revenue Work Group. I think those are cuts that would definitely be harmful to greater Minnesota and to the kinds of projects that were just referred to here. You know, the Minnesota Business Development Public Infrastructure Grants. Alexandria was a recipient of one of those in 2003, $300,000 grant for construction of water and sewer lines to the industrial park here. And I'm told the 3 businesses have relocated to the park, creating 42 new and full-time jobs. Those are the kind of, again, public investments that pay off with the private sector business location decisions and jobs for people in Alexandria. And I think to eliminate those kind of grants for water for solid waste is going in the wrong direction. We're going to have to look for ways we can fund. Those are capital-intensive projects, ever increasingly expensive projects that are increasingly beyond the means of local governments and their citizens, and inevitably then a result if the state and federal government don't step forward with a higher property tax burden, and it makes it more difficult for people to afford to be living in greater Minnesota. And as one woman in Ada said to me, you know, those of us who live in the metropolitan area should be glad that there are still people who want to and can afford to live in greater Minnesota, because as she said, if everyone had to move into the metropolitan area, then it would take 2 hours to get from Minneapolis to St. Paul rather than 1 hour. Although I can attest that driving around these days, that sometimes it's almost 2 hours the way it's going now. But the point being, again, we need to make it affordable for everybody to live in where they choose to live in this state, and we need to provide partnership and funds to local governments, the state level, and one of my jobs as governor would be to work with our congressional delegation and make sure that we're maximizing what we can do at the federal level, because this is going to be an ongoing challenge for our state and for our nation to make these investments, these capital improvements. And if we fail to do so, if we leave substandard infrastructure for future generations, or we're really shortchanging them. You know, back after World War II, the greatest generation came back and paid income taxes and built the interstate highway system, and the federal debt was never greater than 3% of total revenues, because they made a commitment to pay-as-you-go to make the infrastructure investments that we've been living off of and benefiting from, thriving from, for the last 50 years. And if we as a society today aren't willing to make that same commitment, then we're not only going to shortchange our standard of living and quality of life, but we're also going to provide a burden that's really unfair to the future generations.
Thank you, Senator. We're now going to move off of the topic of economic development and move into the judicial system. Our question comes from Ms. Kritz.
Senator Dayton, in a recent address, Minnesota Supreme Court Chief Justice Lori Gilday stated that we are on the brink. If our already overburdened system is further cut, it will begin to break down. Think about the arrest warrant that doesn't get signed quickly enough, the order for protection that isn't issued, trials that get set into the far distant future, victims forced to wait months and years for resolution, small claims cases taking so long that the process does no good. What is your plan to ensure that our judiciary is adequately funded so that the people of Minnesota will have a place to turn when their families, freedom, and property are threatened?
I think the Chief Justice is correct. And 2 years ago, the previous Chief Justice said almost the same thing. And his budget was slashed, proposed by Governor Plenty, and then part of that was restored by the legislature, but it was still cut. It certainly was not reflecting the increased need for those services. And the Chief Justice was reduced to literally getting in his own car and driving around the state to try to make this case to legislators and to the people, which I don't think he should ever have been forced into that situation. When I became state auditor in 1991, Governor Arne Carlson, a Republican, said to me that I was a independently elected constitutional officer elected by the people of Minnesota, and that he would take the budget that I proposed and he would submit that as I proposed it to the legislature. If I'm elected governor, I will say the same to the Chief Justice, and I will urge her to have a budget that reflects what those needs are, and I will submit that budget to the legislature, because she is the chief administrative officer for the courts as well as being the Chief Justice, and I respect that that's her responsibility and her authority. And I certainly have heard from law enforcement personnel, from court personnel, from public defenders and others involved all over the state, the serious effects of the cuts that have occurred. And justice delayed is justice denied. And the integrity of our judicial process, I think, is really at stake here, and I will support her.
Well, without question, we do need to make sure that we're providing adequate funding for our judicial system, but I don't think that you give any branch of government or any department a blank check. I think instead the next governor of the state of Minnesota has to be willing to say, I'm going to work with everybody to set priorities and to make smart decisions that work for the whole state. And certainly a judicial system that works, that delivers fair and equal justice is a high priority. We do need to increase funding. I'll acknowledge that. But I don't think it's through a blank check. I think we're going to have to do some things in different ways. We are going to have to bring more technology into the criminal justice system so that all of the law enforcement agencies, the courts, all of the different departments involved in bringing and adjudicating bringing people to justice and adjudicating the decisions can be integrated so that everybody knows what it is they're dealing with. There are some of those kinds of things that we can do to make sure that we have adequate funding. But I think the challenges of the courts go beyond funding. We have to be thoughtful about making sure we're protecting the integrity of the courts. And it does worry me when we see the judicial process now being subjected to partisan elections. Look what's happened in Wisconsin, Texas, West Virginia, where huge amounts of money have come into judicial elections, and I think undermine the people's confidence in the quality, the integrity, the impartiality of court decisions. And so I do support former Governor Quee in his proposal to have retention elections. Give everybody still the opportunity to vote on judges, but make sure that we're not polarizing and politicizing our judicial elections. I think that's one of the most important things that the next governor is going to have to do, is lead the way on making sure that we are protecting the integrity of the courts. And it starts with appointments. And so my commitment is to use the merit selection process, not just for the trial courts where it has been effective, where Minnesota has been a leader, but I think we need to expand it to the appellate court and make sure that all of our justices are there on the basis of merit, not on the basis of favor.
Thank you, Mr. Horner. Moving on now to the topic of our state budget. This will be our last topic that we're going to cover, unless we want to spend some more time going back on some of them that we already covered. But right now, the topic is the state budget, and our first question will go from Mayor Ness to Mr. Horner.
Mr. Horner, will you please tell me your 2 or 3 top ideas for raising state revenue collections?
Well, I'll tell you my version of it, and then I'm sure Senator Dayton will tell you his version of my plan. So let me tell you my version of it. I think we do need tax reform. I think we have an outdated tax system. We've depended too much on income taxes, and that's part of the volatility that we have in Minnesota's tax system. It is the #1 reason why we have had such high peaks and valleys. We can't go back 12 years with the tax system any more than we can go back 12 years with an economy, with technology, with health care, with anything. We need to be looking forward 12 years. And most economists, including Art Rolnick, including others, including Democrats and Republicans, who have looked at our tax system, have said we need to start with business tax reform, not to pad the bottom lines, but to create incentives for investment in technology, in research, in development, in new equipment, in new startup companies. And so put some of the money there, and then pay for it. Pay for it through the consumption tax. We can lower the rate. We can broaden the base to include clothing, like all but a handful of states have done. We can put in the protections for low income, and I have money in there. Maybe we don't start the tax on clothing items under $100. Maybe we exempt children's clothing. We can do those kinds of things. That makes sense. We certainly will continue to exempt groceries, medical services, medical purchases, prescription drugs. When we do those things, most economists would agree that's not a regressive tax, it's a fair tax. But it's also a tax in which everybody in Minnesota pays a little bit of the share. It's transparent. Everybody, when you make a transaction, you see the cost, and you see the cost of government, and that's a good thing. In a society where we have fewer and fewer people paying any income tax, it's too easy for people to say, let's increase the size of government because I don't have to pay for it. A sales tax is transparent. You see it. We'll do it fairly. We'll do it in a way that makes sense. And I also agree that we do need to bring some equity. We do need to capture more income from the wealthiest Minnesotans, but not through the rate increase that is being proposed. That falls too heavily on the job creators among our small businesses. We ought to do it by closing some of the deductions that favor the wealthy. Look at the home mortgage deduction. We allow a deduction of up to $1 million. Do we really need that for our economy, for the housing market? And I say this with the endorsement of the Realtors and the Builders Association. I think we can lower that deduction. We can make the tax system more fair without jeopardizing job creation in Minnesota. And lastly, I do think we ought to raise tobacco taxes for health policy as well as revenue policy. There is no good public policy that supports cheap cigarettes.
Senator Dayton.
Well, I apply the principle that taxes should be fair. And no one likes paying taxes, and I believe that people are willing to do so if they believe that everyone is paying their fair share. And I go back again to the analysis that's been made by the Minnesota Department of Revenue that says the taxes, state and local combined, are regressive in Minnesota. that the top 10% of income earners pay about 80% of their income in state and local taxes compared to everybody else. And the top 1%, people making over $1 million a year, pay only 2/3% of their income in state and local taxes compared to everyone else. And I don't think that's fair. So my principal way of raising revenue would be to increase taxes, the income tax on what the Department of Revenue's estimated is the top 4% of incomes in the state of Minnesota. A second one would be there are people who leave the state for 6 months and a year, a little bit more, and go to low tax or no tax states where they declare their residency, and then they come back to Minnesota and live 5.5 months here and pay no taxes. And I think that's unfair. I think if they're going to spend close to half the year, I'm certainly not going to tax people come here to vacation here or whatever, but people are spending a third or up to close to a half of the year in Minnesota and are using our highways and our public services and are paying no taxes there. I think, again, that's unfair, and that loophole should be closed. And third, the Department of Revenue for the state estimates that there's a significant amount of money to be gained by going after people who just simply evade their taxes entirely. And in fact, kind of surprisingly, that operation within the Department of Revenue was cut in half in this biennium, which seems, given that they raise about $7 for every $1 that that operation costs, it seems to me pretty obvious that that's a good way to, again, create better fairness and also to raise millions of dollars in additional revenue. So I would increase that function.
Thank you. We've now heard your comments on increasing revenues. I think we're going to flip that around a little bit, aren't we, Rick?
Yes, we are. Okay, Senator Dayton, tell me your top 2 or 3 ideas for reducing state spending.
Well, in my website, www.markdayton.org, I've detailed about $1.2 billion in reductions, and one would be to do what the state of Wisconsin's done. It's equivalent of a legislative auditor has looked at the state outsourcing of contracts there and found that, in some cases it's cost effective, better for the taxpayer, better for the result to outsource, but in others it's more costly. So I would have that same review process undertaken by the agencies themselves and look to reduce that where it's going to save taxpayers money and produce a better product. Secondly, I would reduce a sizable number of these 61 tests that are imposed on our students from grades 3 through 11. And third, and it's actually more recent, so it's not even reflected in my current proposal there, but I've met a couple times with executives from one of the leading management consulting firms, private firms, who's done business with Democratic and Republican governors throughout Minnesota, as well as with the mayor of New York City, and said that, kind of disappointingly, his firm, and he's not looking just for the business, he's just making the point there hasn't been the interest, hasn't had a single contract with the Plenty administration during their 8 years. And he says there are hundreds of millions of dollars of savings, and again, I don't have that reflected, but I'll take his word for it, in improving streamlining the administrative functions of state government, such, he calls them back office functions as consolidating accounts payable and some of the human resources and the like. If other states have realized those savings, that Minnesota has the same opportunity, and it is going to be absolutely imperative that we find areas where we can reduce savings and expenditures and yet provide the essential services more cheaply and hopefully even more efficiently. And I intend to apply the same principle that I did when I headed 3 different state agencies, to go in and look at every function and every individual and every aspect of every service being provided there and look for ways in which we could reduce costs and find greater efficiencies, as we did when I was state auditor, and we brought in a private CPA, executive from a private firm. She headed up the auditor function. We provided computers. At that point, there wasn't even back in the early 1991, a computer was three auditors for one computer, laptop, and that was a choke point in terms of their conducting these audits, primarily counties, some school districts, some cities. And by providing a sufficient number of computers, we were able to reduce the amount of time, which meant we reduced the cost to the clients, the local governments, and reduce the cost to taxpayers, and as well as provide a better quality audit. So those are the kind of innovations that I'd look for, the kind of streamlining, and I've already been through the state budget line item by line item twice, and I'm prepared to go through it again, and importantly, I'm going to have my agency heads do the same.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Horner?
Senator, we've now sat here for an hour and 45 minutes, and I don't think I've heard the word no come out of your mouth yet. Instead, what I've heard is that you want to increase education funding, $1,300 per pupil. You want to increase college aid. You want more LGA, more ethanol funding. You want to increase the Small Cities Grant Program, a $1 billion bonding program. Give the courts a blank check. We've got a $6 billion shortfall. And your proposal to reduce it is eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. It doesn't add up. It doesn't add up when you have a tax policy that I think, first of all, is wrong, and secondly, comes $2 billion short by your own estimate. It doesn't add up. It's not going to add up for Minnesotans. It's the same tired answers that we've had that got us into this problem. We need to be bolder. We need to do things differently. We do need to take a hard look at how we spend money. And so I think we need to go and look at how we spend for health care. You know, the governor is right. The cost of public health programs is unsustainable. That doesn't mean you throw people on the street. It means you make tough decisions. We do have to be willing to make investments in how we treat chronic care conditions, in the kinds of programs that we're going to offer. We do have to make hard decisions in holding people accountable for their own health care. We do have to be willing to tax tobacco so that we can reduce the $2 billion in excess medical costs that tobacco imposes on all of us. We need to fundamentally restructure our health care system. We need to take on the challenge of pensions, not when they're collapsing as you've proposed, but on the first day of the next governor's office. Public pensions will make the $6 billion operating deficit look like peanuts if we don't deal with it immediately. And most importantly, it will put retirees and older public workers at great jeopardy. It will undermine their security if we don't start dealing with it now. It's a budget issue, but it's also a moral issue. And it is only an independent that can bring unions together with Republicans to say, here are the solutions. We need to hold harmless older workers and retirees to say that we will keep their retirement secure. And that's a guarantee. We need to say to current workers, we're going to have to get a little bit more out of you. Maybe it's more contribution to your pension plan. Maybe it's extend retirement from 55, as police officers have, to maybe 60. And then we have to say to new workers, young workers, we're going to have to make the transition to a defined contribution plan like most businesses have done. And when we do that, we're going to have to ask you, the taxpayers, sorry to hit you up again, but we're going to have to ask you, the taxpayers, to help pay that transition to a defined contribution plan, because it's the only way we can hold older workers harmless, that we can deliver on that commitment to them. And if we don't deal with this now, the largest public employee pension fund estimates that in 10 years, we will have 60 cents on the dollar. In other words, somebody's going to have to come up with 40 cents, and it will only get worse. And so we can pay a little bit now, or we can pay a lot later. We're much better off in all of these areas to have a governor who's willing to say, these are tough decisions. They're not going to be solved by waste, fraud, and abuse. They're going to be solved by courage and bold decisions.
Well, gentlemen, we thank you for your time. We have concluded all of the topics that we wanted to touch on this evening. And so we thank you very much for being here and participating in our discussion. Also, thank you to our panelists, and thanks to all of you for coming here this evening. And a special thank you we'd like to extend to the folks here at Alexandria Technical and Community College for hosting the event, and to the Alexandria Lakes Area Chamber of Commerce and the Economic Development Commission for sponsoring it and planning it. Now, in terms of the events and the post-event meetings with the candidates, I'm going to give you the specific meeting rooms in just a moment. But before I do, I would like to ask that after I've announced the rooms, if you'd please let Senator Dayton and Mr. Horner get out of here first so that they can make their way to the room before everybody else does. That would be very helpful. And then after they've left, any of you who would like to join them in their respective rooms certainly may do so, and that will give you the opportunity to meet them, talk to them, ask them questions, and so forth. I believe they will be able to stick around here until about 8:45, is that correct? Yep, we have about till 8:45, so about just a little under an hour here. With that said, Senator Dayton, you will be in room 747, and Mr. Horner is in room 753. And if you want to follow these gentlemen here, they'll show you where to go. And again, thank you everyone for coming. Have a great evening, and best of luck to both of you in November.
Thank you very much.